and just a bit of just to share a bit of what we're looking at in the space and how we go about doing it. So high level, this is basically what I'm going to cover this morning or this afternoon. Basically, who the IDC is, what our unit does, why we're interested in gaming, how we fund into the space. We'll run through a couple of examples of gaming titles and studio funding, so just the how-tos. And finally, a little bit of what we'd like to see a bit more of. So just firstly, a bit of background to the IDC. I think all of this helps contextualize who we are, and it just sets up why it is we fund in certain ways. So we're a state-owned entity. We report to the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, the DTIC. We've been around for about 80 years. And our mandate is economic growth and industrial development. The areas that we fund in are pretty diverse. You'd see a lot of focus into manufacture and actual industrialization, energy, tourism, mining, agro-processing, a bit of service work, and of course, manufacturing. Our unit then falls within the services division of the IDC. And just high level, some of the principles that we work on when we fund. We are a self-funded organization, so we don't get a allocation from National Treasury. Instead, we, like any other commercial bank or fund out there, we go out and we raise money on local and international capital markets. So as a result, when we lend on commercial terms and lend to receive our money back. We aren't a grant issuing organization. In essence, we operate like a commercial bank, but we have a strong developmental hat, like any DFI. We have a balance sheet of about $15 billion at present, and we operate in SA, SADC, and the rest of Africa. I sit in a unit called Media and Audiovisual, that's a MAV. And in essence, what our mission is just to be the driving force of development of a sustainable media value chain within South Africa. And when we talk value chain, we talk about everything that you see on screen, on multiple platforms, as well as the engine behind it. So whether it's the production team, whether it's the actual tech, whether it's the actual software, it's that entire value chain that we look at funding into. Specifically, there are four main areas. So content. So whether that's something you'd see on television, something you'd see streaming online, something you'd see, you'd pay a ticket for and go to a theatrical release. Those are pieces of content that we fund into. We fund infrastructure, so brick and mortar. We fund platforms, so any kind of digital delivery system for this content to a medium. This is something that we fund. And finally, it's anything in the interactive media space. So in this case, it would be gaming, but AR, VR, different forms of gaming, esports, anything in this entertainment and media space. Just some notable investments, and this just give a bit of context as to what we fund and the scale of our funding. There's Cape Town Film Studios. It's a production and post-production studio based out in Cape Town. Skyring Studios, also a production and post-production studio based in the heart of Johannesburg. The MSG Africa Group. This is a mixed media group which has notable investments in radio, in particular Power FM and Capricorn FM. There's some pieces of content that we funded. So for instance, Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, starring Idris Elba, Tsotsi, two pieces of animation, Zambezi and Kumba. So these just highlight the kinds of investments that we get involved in. You'll see it's pretty noticeable that we don't fund into, we haven't funded into gaming as yet. So it's a pretty new area for us, but it's something that we'd like to explore a bit more. So, why exactly is an organization such as ours, which is so focused on manufacture and industrialization, why are we interested in funding in the gaming space? So I think just firstly, from a metrics point of view, we're dealing with a massive industry. It's $160 billion as of May this year. And for scale, it's 4 times as big as any theatrical box office takings, and that's 4 times what was recorded in 2019. So ignoring the effect of COVID this year, 3 times as big as music releases. So we're dealing with a massive industry over here. Within the South African context, we understand it's about a 2.5 billion rand industry, and about just over 20% of the population can be considered as gamers. So from a metrics point of view, we're dealing with an industry which is large, which has a lot of growth potential, and a lot of room to scale up. Some of the positives that we're seeing in this space is that we understand that we have, very attractive labor costs within the country. We've got a fair amount of good infrastructure, whether it's actual cables running in the ground, your networks, fiber, access to cloud computing, those sorts of things. We quite get up in that regard. We have the benefit of a strong currency when it comes to importing of like dollars, for instance. If a dollar goes a long way within the South African economy. We have a very strong English workforce, so that makes it easier to work with international teams. And for all intents and purposes, our gaming sector, although nascent and pretty small, it's survived and thrived without much government intervention. I think just a final point I'd like to point out with regards to an overall picture as to why we want to get involved in gaming. There's about 5 pillars of game development that we consider critical. And within that space, there are 2 which I think we are particularly strong in. Firstly, it's the programming skills we have within South Africa. You see that largely in the fintech space. So there's a strong capability within SA, which sits. It might be housed outside of gaming, but the capability is still there. Secondly, our animation and creative design skills are pretty world class. We've got a very strong animation sector here, and I think an underlying kind of community which is interested in the creative arts and those sorts of things. Areas for improvement would be with regards to budgeting and planning. So scheduling, hitting milestones, those sorts of key elements with regards to game development. Secondly, the business side of things, so connecting with networks, turning or translating game development into businesses. I think it's a set of skills that needs to be bulked up on. And I think just finally, overall game design. There's a couple of schools that we have running in SA at the moment, whether it's through UCT, through WITS, Open Window, Vega, etc. These all exist, but I think our skills need to be upped a bit more in that regard. From a beneficial point to South Africa, as to why we'd be looking at funding into gaming, it would address a large problem with regards to youth employment. This space largely employs younger people. So funding into an industry such as gaming helps with a major challenge in the South African economy. We have a remote workforce in the space. So as we've seen with regards to the last 6 months and the digital working economy, gaming is already set up for this. So it already comes with a massive plus. There's a potential for massive FDI if we invest in the space, either by exporting good titles or bringing in additional service work. And I think just for me, it's the big thing as to why we want to get involved in the space is the links between media on one hand and technology on the other. There's massive tech areas in the forms of machine learning, AI, areas in augmented reality and whatnot, which are there in SA and can be explored further. But media, and in particular gaming, forms almost a bridge between creative arts and this higher tech kind of space. So it's an important space for us to be playing. And of course, we aren't just looking at casual games, we're looking at serious games as well. And the applications in this space are vast, and the sky is kind of the limit. There's applications within education, applications within training, and these are important fields for which we are interested in and would like to support. Just a couple of principles of IDC funding. So this just gives a bit of color as to what it is we do and why we do it. When we fund into productions or any type of content, any type of platform, we always look at co-funding. So we'd like some additional partner to be involved with us, to share risk and to come along with us, whether that's in the form of another commercial bank, private entities, individual families. Just the sharing of risk is a key principle for us. The second thing is we look at strong partnerships. So it's forming partnerships either with a technical body, with a technical organization or whatnot. It's these sorts of partnerships which you look at when we fund. We look for strong jockeys, strong management teams. So we're funding in a space where security might be pretty low, and we have to rely heavily on the actual jockey behind the investment. So understanding how strong they are, working with teams which have good dynamics, which are diverse, that's critical for us. We focus quite heavily on cash flows. So if you've ever been through an IDC DD, you'd understand that we place massive emphasis on certainties of cash flows, timings of cash flows, just to understand and structure our products pretty strongly. We like working with proven concepts. So, because of the nature of our funding, the instruments that we have, we don't necessarily have the luxury or the instruments on hand to be funding into prototypes, proof of concepts, and those sorts of things. We'd like there to be some sort of certainty as to the revenue streams before we fund. And we have a floor of about R1 million. So the minimum check size that we write is $1 million. The ceiling is $1 billion. If we are funding into SADC, the floor is about $3 million. If we are funding into the rest of Africa, it's $5 million. There's a bit of variability in the spaces, but generally those are kind of the ticket sizes that we're looking for. When approaching us for funding, it's sometimes a confusing space to be looking at. If you approach a commercial bank, they're pretty standard in how they lend. You present them a plan which makes sense and they will lend to you. Ours does operate in a similar kind of vein, but there are two main levers to our funding. The first is lever number one, financial viability. Does your project's cash flow stack up? Do the numbers tie up? Does it make sense? If we're injecting R1 million into your proposal, do you have sufficient cash flow to then repay us within the time frame that we require? Do your growth assumptions make sense, as well as your unit economics? So, for example, within a South African context, if you are planning on releasing a video game title, and you're projecting 50,000 unit sales in an annum, does that really make sense in terms of what global metrics are? And finally, risk sharing. So is the sponsor on board sharing sufficiently with us? All of these kind of tie into what we'd call lever number one. So is this plan that you're presenting to us financially viable? Secondly, is what you're presenting to us societally relevant? What we stand for as a development bank is to address either market issues or issues within the wider South African context which require addressing. So is the plan that you present to us dealing with employment? So are you creating jobs? Are you including youth, women, PDIs, either at an equity level or in your employment level? Are you replacing imports, for instance? So if there's a piece of tech, a piece of software, for argument's sake, a Unity or an Unreal Engine, and you somehow develop an engine of your own, then you'd be replacing an import, and that would be heavily key for us in a South African dynamic. Are you introducing new kinds of technology, which either are a South African first, an African first, a world first? Those sorts of things are what we look at when we look at lever number two. Is your business plan societally relevant? If you manage to pull on both these levers, then the chances of us funding are pretty high. With regard to the process of funding, we run through a 6-step process. Firstly, we deal with you at an inquiry level. So it's just a basic handshake, a sit around the table. Does your business plan make sense at a high level? Are we dealing with something which we can potentially look at? Assuming we go past that stage, we do what's called a basic assessment. In essence, a desktop assessment of your plan. Again, assessing viability and mandate fit. We'd present this to an internal committee within our team. We'd sit around, deliberate, and we decide whether we want to support it or not. Assuming we go ahead with that, we then move on to due diligence. So it's a focus on key specific areas and a deep dive into your actual plan. We then take your plan up to an investment committee. It's an investment committee with several independent and existing ExCo members, and they assess your plan to see whether or not it makes sense and whether we'd like to support. Assuming you get a yes, we then move on to legal closure, and then finally disbursement. When we deep dive into the due diligence, there are 5 areas that we look at. Financial risks. So is the plan that you're presenting to us commercially sound from a financial point of view? Are you dealing with financial instruments which make sense? Can you repay us on time? Are there any other financial risks present within your business plan? What are the market risks in your deal? So if you are pushing out a particular studio or gaming title, but you don't have access, for instance, to the necessary networks out there who can deliver this, that would be a risk. How are you mitigating it? What about technical risks in your business? So do you have the necessary licenses? Do you have the necessary competencies within your management team? Do you have the available skills to build this product up from a technical perspective? We look at your management team. So across the board, besides the technical skills, do you guys work together well? Do you have the necessary skills in other areas? Legal, HR, commercial, financial, and finally legal risks. So what are the legal risks which sit within a particular type of transaction, and how would those have a bearing on our investment? We are a organization which doesn't have hundreds of thousands of clients, and as such we do quite a bit of hand holding. So post investment we'd still be involved in the business to some extent. It might be sitting on a board, it might be quarterly meetings that we have with you. So there's ongoing monitoring. If necessary, we might have to inject some sort of business support into your business just to help you achieve the goals that you hope to achieve. The general funding terms that we work with. So there's about 5 different types of major instruments that we inject into any type of transaction. It's asset-backed senior debt, working capital senior debt. So these 2 senior debt facilities would be for a business which it has a bit more certainty with regards to the cash flows. It might have a gap either in fulfilling a contract, in trying to scale up, those sorts of things. We can do contract-backed finance as well. On some of the more riskier types of transactions and which require a bit more early stage capital support, we do inject MES and equity kind of facilities, either as sub-debt or prefs. The costs of these fundings, or the terms rather, generally at a high level, asset-backed seniors, generally 3 to 5 years, again, situationally dependent. Working capital, we're generally looking at about a 4-year term. And on the MES facilities, we generally don't like stretching past 7 years. The cost of our funding, again, risk-dependent, client-dependent. So I'm just putting on indicative values on here just so people can get an idea of what it is that we potentially could do. On the senior debt facilities, we're generally looking at around prime from +2 to +5 ballpark figures. It can go lower, it can go higher. On our MES and equity figures facilities, we're generally looking at a rate of about 13%. At a nominal basis, that works out to about 20%. If you then compare us to existing VCs and MES financiers in the space, you can see we're pretty competitive in that regard. We do have specific funding schemes that come online now and then. So at present, there's a Grow Youth scheme. How it works is if you, as the principal shareholder, own either 26 to 20 or 50% of a particular business, and you are creating at least 2 jobs for every million rand that we lend you, you can get funding of up to prime -3. It's heavily competitive and heavily attractive. My apologies, there's some birds chirping outside over here, so if you hear them, they're just chatting away. I'm going to just run through what it is we look at from a funding of the studio. So how would that look like? What we'd look for in this regard, we'd look for a team with a good track record. So they've either delivered in this space. So they've delivered projects. They've either delivered projects of a content type of nature. If they're creating a game, they've delivered successful games before. If they're looking at creating some sort of ed tech, they have delivered that before. So there is some sort of track record. With regard to management experience, whether the team has at least sufficient experience to run a business, whether they've dealt with finance before, whether they've dealt with HR issues before. Is there another funder on board? It's something we'd look at. And overall, does the business plan make sense? What we'd fund in that space would be as follows. We'd look at funding infrastructure. So the actual brick and mortar behind the place, perhaps there's a need for hardware. We could look at funding all of those things. We could look at funding software in that space. So, there might be a need for licenses and those sorts of things. We'd look at funding that. There might be a need for working capital. So you either want to scale up, you have a challenge with funding labor and those sorts of things. We could fund in that space. We're not limited to casual games. So it's something I want to emphasize. We look at serious games. If you're looking at creating some sort of training software, we can fund that. And we're not limited just to gaming. If it's esports you're looking at, come and chat to us. We can potentially work out some sort of scheme. Things we'd avoid: excessive startup losses. It's not something that we're looking at taking on. If you're dealing with a client with heavy management fees, again, not something that we'll be looking at funding, as well as heavy R&D. So just a bit more of an example in this space. So a client approaches us. They're an existing studio, so they've delivered on content before. They have clients on book. They aren't heavily geared, so their balance sheet is pretty clean. They now want to take on a bit more work. And, this is because of the work they want to take on. They're either going to create more employment, they're going to encourage more imports into the country, they're going to increase technical skills within the SA environment. That for us is a typical kind of deal that we were looking at. The maybes for us would be if there's a new co. So we can look at new companies, and perhaps you've done some sort of client delivery. Maybe all haven't been profitable, but there is some sort of history, maybe not as defined as an existing well-established studio, but there is something to show us. Things would be a no. So if you have no relevant experience, you've either never worked in the space before, no experience in dealing with the client, no experience in securing clients, it's unfortunately not something we'd be looking at. Prototyping, so that's like concept development and those sorts of things. We unfortunately can't fund in that space. And if there's no development impact, so if situationally this makes no sense for us as a South African state-owned entity to be getting involved in, then unfortunately it's not something that we'd be looking at. What about funding of a title? So, what we'd be looking for is if there's some sort of developed concept. So you either gone out and you want to make a game. I don't know. It's a racing game. It's a South African racing game with some sort of flavor, but you've created a version of it, which you've gone, and it's enough to have shopped with a publisher. It's enough to have shopped with a platform already. These things aren't cheap to make. I get. But you've spent 200,000 to R1 million on a concept as it is. You've got a publisher which has looked at it. They potentially are interested in the space. You've got a co-financier particularly. There's a clear plan. There's clear milestones to what you want to deliver on. That's what we're looking at from a funding of a title point of view. What we can fund in that regard, it's the actual development of the game. So once you've got a concept and it's shopped around and it's something that looks like it does have legs to then make commercial sense, we can fund the dev of the game. We can fund a basket of titles. So if you bring us 5 titles that you want to fund, we can potentially look at funding a basket of titles. We are platform agnostic. So whether you're looking at PC, mobile, traditional console, we're agnostic in that regard. And again, casual, serious games, anything works. What we'd avoid, again, concept development, teams with no experience. And I want to stress this last point. Guys come to us and say, we'd like to make this. It's going to be the next great Fortnite. It's going to be the next Call of Duty. But little little commercial sense exists behind the idea. And some of these things might be difficult to test with the market. But when we are chatting to you, we'd like to at least see that you've applied your mind to test whether this thing can make sense from a marketability point of view. I think what needs to be appreciated as well is that there aren't many other funders out there, in the continent, who are looking at funding into gaming. We've done quite a bit of research into DFIs globally, into commercial banks globally. Many of them don't play in this space. So as an organization, we are stepping into a space which is traditionally not funded, but because of what we see that can be done in this space, this is why we're getting involved. So I think just finally, what is it that we'd like to see more of as a DFI in the space? Firstly, we're dealing with an industry which is pretty small. It's fragmented. You got guys who are working in their garages. Maybe there's a couple of guys working for an animation studio at the moment, and they're just working on some titles part-time. There's a couple of really cool animation studios sitting out here in SA who have delivered content, to the international market before. But we're not dealing with an industry which has scale. We want to see more collaboration. So, are you guys working together more? Are you co-opting skills from the fintech space, for instance? Are you trying to crowd in skills from other areas and bring in a lot more collaboration? Is this industry inclusive? So, at the moment, the demographic is heavily skewed towards white male. Are doors being opened to allow people of color, to allow females in, to allow younger devs into the space? It's this kind of inclusion that we'd like to see. We'd love to see more lobbying of government by you guys as an industry. So government would be interested in funding a gaming incentive, for instance. So you guys as an industry need to get together, co-opt and lobby government. It's something that we'd love to see. We need to see more innovation in the space. We're dealing with constrained resources here in South Africa. We don't have the benefit of massive amounts of available income, either sitting at a commercial or a state level, to be thrown into a vast variety of different industry sectors and heavily risky ventures. So this requires some innovative thinking. Can we do more with less, in essence? Also on the fundraising side, can we look at different models of fundraising? Crowdfunding, for instance. Can you create a game, a concept dev game, by going around your high net worth individuals, collecting funds? It's innovation that we'd love to see a lot more of. I touched on this earlier, but there's scope and there's room and there's enough skill here in SA and the rest of the continent for strong software dev. So either our own uniquely African Unreal or Unity engine, these can be done down here, and we'd love to see something like that. And I think just finally, I've coined it a great SA exports, but it taps into African exports as well. It's something that we're hoping to see along this journey, and it would be a massive plus for us if it does materialize. So I think that's just my short and sweet. Here's our website. Please do check us out, see what we're all about. My contact number and email address is there as well. If you want to reach out, please feel free to do so. Connect via LinkedIn as well. We're pretty responsive, so if you've got an idea and you want to just chat to us, drop me a mail, give us a call. We'll get back to you and see if there's anything we can help you.